Hey everybody, welcome back to another one. Last time we looked at industrialization and the sort of beginning of industrial capitalism and how that was shaking out what it looked like, the development of machines and the use of fossil fuels. This time we're going to look at how that system created new forms of culture, what it actually brought to society, and how people began to critique that system, make arguments that it was helpful or not helpful, or look for alternatives, or try to understand the effect that it was having on the world around them, and how to sort of navigate within this new economic and energy system the world suddenly sort of found itself in. So industrialization, industrial society, industrial capitalism, however we want to frame this, brought a ton of material benefits to societies. But it also unleashes this whole new set of really dramatic social changes that transform the way people live their everyday lives in almost every aspect, to the point where it's hard to sort of go backwards and get out of that system. So naturally, with big changes like this, critics come forward and claim that it's moving in the wrong direction, or the benefits are not being applied evenly, or it's bad for society, all of these sorts of things. So what do we make of that? How do we start to understand the actual effects that industrialization had on people and the critiques that were made of it and continue to be made of it today? So first, we'll look at industrial society, the sort of shape that it takes and what it actually does bring to people, how it transforms society. Then we'll look at what Marx and other communists have called alienation and the sorts of negative reactions that people begin to experience when face to face with the sort of new realities industrialization brought to their world. And then we'll look at very strong critiques of industrial society and perhaps some alternatives that folks hope to establish in the 1800s and into the early 1900s. So first, when we're talking about industrial capitalism and the way it shapes society, some of this stuff is so rapid and so crazy, so new, that it really just took people by surprise. What does it look like when you move off the farm, where you work outside from sunup to sundown essentially, and you move into a city, you move into a factory, you work inside? What sort of effects does that have? And not only on the individual, but on the way people live, the communities they live in, how they identify, these sorts of questions. The first thing you might want to know is that it's not all negative. In fact, industrialization brings tremendous gains to people's lives. There's a whole new set of material wealth and culture that becomes affordable for most people. It's not even, it takes time to get all of these benefits to everyone. There are still millions of people around the world that don't have these things. But by and large, the average person, if we can talk about someone, an average person, starts to have these sorts of things in their house. When you have factories producing clothing, plumbing, cast iron objects, dishes, you get a whole new sort of set of material culture that the average person would have. What things do they have in their house? How do they use these things? You can look at this illustration and you can see tons of new stuff, right, that would have been relatively novel and life-changing for the average person. So you have a cast iron fireplace to heat your home instead of a smaller furnace. They have a hot water heater. They have a clock. This woman's clothes were probably made in a factory. She wasn't sewing them by hand. There's standardized dishes, bricks, right, that are more uniform, floorboards that are more uniform. The bucket, right, would have been made in a factory. All these sorts of things you can kind of pick out. Running water, right? In order for that to work well, you need plumbing. In order for plumbing to be more universal, you need to be able to produce the steel and the pipes to make those sorts of things. So lots of stuff going on here. Food begins to become a factory product. Electricity is starting to get into homes, though that's going to be a slow process, right? So all of these things combined, you can start talking about a standard of living. How did the average standard of living change? Well, industrialization made people essentially have bigger homes, cleaner homes, more functional homes within some contexts. It's going to get tricky because we're going to see there's a flip side to all of this as well. But for certain individuals, really quickly, the benefits of industrialization were very apparent. And a lot of things that we have around us, well, pretty much everything around us now, comes out of some sort of factory, right? Most people think about the clothes you're wearing, the table you're at, the food you're going to eat later. All of these things were sort of done in a factory environment in terms of how they were produced or processed or sold to you. So people are starting to live longer. People are starting to have more babies. There's even things that start to develop like leisure and parks and stuff like this we'll see coming out of these industrial movements too. So last time I tried to present industrialization kind of as straightforward as possible, and this time I have to give you the sort of critiques of it, but always keep in the background that at the same time, all of these new sort of cultural products are improving people's lives, and that's one of the big trade-offs. Another aspect of industrial society that we might look at is a huge explosion in population. So as the standard of living goes up, people are living longer. As it gets easier and easier to procure food and shelter and things like this, people are having more babies. So you can take a look at the population in Europe or in the United States from maybe 1750 to 1900. It goes nuts, right? So here on this graph, there's a blue line that marks the sort of generally considered era where industrialization begins. So you look at the population for the world, it's relatively flat in terms of billions of people going for thousands of years. And then right around the time of industrialization, you see this huge uptick in population. And it shows no particular sign of stopping anytime soon, although it will have to eventually. So if you look between 17 and 1800, the population in Europe, roughly speaking, goes from about 100 million to about 180 million. So it goes up about 80% in 100 years. It's pretty amazing. In America, or in the Americas more broadly speaking, you go from about 13 million to 24 million. So it almost doubles, right, in that same 100 years. But from 1800 to 1900, it's way quicker. In Europe, you go from about 180 million to 390 million. So the population doubles in 100 years, right? Instead of just going up 80%, it's 100%. But in the Americas, if you look, you go from 24 million to 145 million. It's an absolute incredible, what's that, like 6 times? In part, that's due to migration, right? Lots of people from Europe are going to come to the Americas, but also people from Asia and India as well, as we'll kind of see. And it gets to the point where population density is going to be so thick that by the early 1900s, a lot of industrialized societies, you actually see the birth rates slowing down to the point where some nations today have a negative birth rate, like Japan, for example. More folks die each year than are born, right? And so this is a pretty big problem for Japanese society in some ways, sort of the grain of Japanese society. There's more old people than young people, for example, and we'll talk more about that later. So why is that happening? Well, as we'll see, you know, a lot of people today don't even want to have babies, right? Because it's like they're really expensive. You got to pay for them to go to college, all these sorts of things. So as society gets more and more dense, you see these sorts of drop-offs happening. This is coupled with a really broad-scale increase in urbanization around the world. Remember, factories can't necessarily be out in the rural countryside. They can't be on farms. These really big machines can't fit in someone's house. So you have to have new towns spring up, or you have to put factories on the edge of cities. So you get millions of people moving from farms to cities, that rural to urban migration. You also get transcontinental migration, people going from the east coast of the United States, all these new technologies like railroads and barbed wire, as funny as that sounds, allow Americans to sweep across the United States right to the west, or in fact, incorporate new lands into the United States. But this comes at a price. Remember last time when we looked at the factory and you said, well, you bring everything to the factory, right? Railroads, water, raw materials, laborers. So a lot of housing develops around factories specifically to bring workers to those environments. But if you can imagine, factory housing is not really that great. A whole new sort of housing is required to shelter these thousands of people that would come to work. So when you look at this image, for example, here's the Lower East Side, New York, you see these really big kind of apartment housing. The whole idea behind these is how do you get as many people kind of into a small space as possible so that they're close to the sites of production. Tenement housing, if you've heard that word before, it usually has a sort of a negative association. These are housing units or housing projects that are made by the city or by factories themselves with the explicit goal not of being lovely or housing people or anything like that, but simply cramming people into the space as efficiently as possible. Not efficient in terms of the people and the comfort, but efficient in terms of the factory and the workers being as close to their jobs as possible. Remember, there's not really any cars yet, so you can't work a tremendously far distance from your home. Along with these, as we talked about, right, there's a number of improvements. So cities for the first time around the world are getting things like sewers and parks and running water, building codes, right? If you're going to be building these big new buildings where hundreds of people's lives are at risk if the building falls over, you might want to have some assurances that the building was built in a certain way where it's not going to catch fire or fall over. Water, obviously, running into a building is super important. Sewage, being able to get rid of it is super important. But this all takes time, and not everybody gets the same thing. This leads to the development of what typically you might call slums, or like, the parts of town that nobody really wants to live, but it's where poor people are pushed together. These tend to be close to where they work, but sort of also out of sight of the elites or the middle class who don't particularly want to see the poor or the homeless. It's hard to think of, if you have like a farming village, with a few hundred people that all work on farms, there's not really going to be slums, right? You can't just crowd a bunch of people together in one place. This is really an urban phenomenon, and it's really something that happens more and more as industrialization takes place and as capitalism becomes more of the main sort of overriding economic principle. Along with the development of these new urban spaces, you have entirely new sort of classes of people that operate within these worlds and operate within industrial society. So remember, we looked a little bit at the factories earlier. You have sort of two general classes that are emerging: the people who actually own the factories and who make money off of what they own, right? Capitalists. You also have working class people who work in the factories and essentially get paid a rate for their labor. But something else is going to happen. There's a new middle class as well. So the industrial elites are beginning to replace merchants or the aristocracy or military elites, church elites. Basically, if you're really, really wealthy, that's how you know you're at the top of the social order. That wasn't always true. If you had religious power or a noble title, that was in some cases much more important than wealth. But now when you think about your heroes, for example, my guess is that most of your heroes happen to also be wealthy, which is kind of strange and a sort of newer phenomenon. People have power, or people fill our imagination in large part because they're wealthy, which is relatively new. That wasn't always the marker for what made someone elite or what made someone have social power. Then you have the working class, like we talked about, right, who are the generally poorer folks who actually do the manual labor. They actually work in the factories. They actually move things, build things, do things. But you have this new group as well, the middle class. So here in this image, you're supposed to be seeing these sort of middle class folks. These are people who work. They do tend to be paid hourly. They're not capitalists. They don't have tons and tons of money, but they make enough money, or they're in the right situation to where they also have leisure time. They have extra money. So they're able to support themselves, support their needs, and have money left over each week or each month to be able to go do things like have brunch or something like this. But you have to be a little careful here. A lot of people assume middle class means the majority of people, or the people in the middle. But that's not really it. It's just a way of describing people who are not way up here like the functional elite, They're not the working class poor. They're something else. They tend to have evolved from these working class poor groups, and they have sort of enough extra money, enough extra resources to be able to participate in some aspects of elite culture. This group is going to grow, and this group is going to be responsible for a lot of changes coming in the 19th and 20th century. So along with this new sort of class structure and urbanization, you get a funny new sort of thing that we tend to take for granted as being real, but at one time had to be invented. And this is the idea that poverty and criminality are real and that we need sort of police to deal with them. This was fairly new to urban society. Again, if you think about living on a small farming community where there's only a couple dozen people, theft doesn't really make a lot of sense. You're not going to steal from one of your neighbors when there's only 10 people and everybody knows each other. If I steal my neighbor's wheelbarrow, not only are they going to see it on my property, they're going to know it's theirs, and there's not going to be any way to sort of argue out of it. So sort of small-scale theft and criminality wasn't really common in those sorts of communities. As communities get bigger and denser, it becomes easier and easier for those things to happen. If you're living in an apartment with 50 different units, and there's tons of people that you don't know, or that don't know you, it makes the idea of theft more possible. If you steal from one of your neighbors, they're probably never going to necessarily know about it. They don't see inside your apartment, they don't see where you go to work, right? These sorts of things. Also, since you're dealing in cash, right, being able to steal cash is a thing anyway, whereas on a village you might trade more in kind for the product you grow and stuff like that. So this idea that you have theft, that you have crime, changes. The idea that poverty is a real thing also is something fairly new. On the village, of course, there are different levels of economic success or failure. People's crops fail. People make bad choices in what they're going to try to grow or where. But there isn't huge disparities in terms of wealth in the typical village. You might have one or two quite wealthy people who are land lords that rent out properties to other people. But by and large, you don't have this sort of wild disparity. In urban environments, once industrialization happens, you get more and more differentiation between wealthy elites and the poor. As you get things like running water and electricity and glass windows and all this sort of stuff, the people who don't have those new things come to be seen as being left behind by these advances. They're missing their standard of life. So you really do get groups of people who live longer, they're healthier. Everything about their life seems to be easier because they have these new technologies to help them out. And then you have groups of people that don't. And we tend to call those people poor. But that distinction is somewhat arbitrary. Also, you need new groups of people to enforce these sorts of ideas. This tends to be police or some sort of town regulation. Remember, nothing is illegal until you make a law that says it is. Nothing is like naturally illegal. And so things like sleeping outside, well, it's not somehow like some God-given thing that that's illegal. But you might make that illegal in cities if you're trying to make them safe or clean, or you're trying to regulate what poor people can and can't do. So all of these sorts of things emerge out of this new sort of industrial society in cities. They're not natural, they don't come wholesale, they're all patched together. Remember, if you're trying to cram as many people into one space as possible, you're going to see results of that. You're going to see more sort of problems emerge. And we tend to refer to these things as crime or poverty and think that they're natural, right? But so keep an eye out for that, because we're going to see more of these sorts of things that appear to be natural, or now we take them for granted as if they're just part of human society. But again, they were sort of invented or reinforced in certain ways they hadn't been before. Another interesting development in industrialized societies or under industrial capitalism is that gender dynamics change relatively quickly, kind of back and forth, seemingly in unexpected ways. So initially, it was women and children that were the primary laborers in factories. And this doesn't necessarily fit with our images. We imagine men in factories primarily, right? Like working steel and stuff like that. But originally, women and children were seen like the perfect employees because women and children have smaller arms and hands. They could reach back into machines. That's lovely. But they were also the ones that, if they had any additional free time in the home on the farm, would have done small side jobs, sewing, weaving, collecting things. And so when these rural families were first being recruited to work in industrial jobs, it was the women and children that were seen as having a little bit of extra additional free time that they could use for industrial output to make some extra money for the family. However, that started to cause a lot of problems because remember, factory workers are paid by the hour in cash. So on farming families, you wouldn't have necessarily had a lot of cash, right? You're raising a crop to be sold at the end of the year. A lot of things are on credit or a lot of things are done in kind. But all of a sudden, you had women and children coming home with cash in hand and being able to buy things. And that sort of threw a wrench in the sort of home gender dynamics that people in Europe and then later the United States were used to. So pretty quickly, men sought to replace women in these sorts of jobs, and then it became seen as natural that men would be the ones working in factories, would be the one earning income for the household, and these sorts of things, because as the entire family was moved off the farm to the factory, men were no longer needed to do the heavy lifting on the farm, so they could more fully be involved in factory labor. And then if they were the ones more fully involved in factory labor, making more money, they would be in the position to make decisions in the household. So women are going to remain essential, but unvalued essentially within the factory system. You also start to get divisions of labor based on gender or sex, such as men working obviously in more heavy industry fields that tended to pay a little bit better, and women working in more traditionally female fields like sewing. So here you have this example of women working in a sewing factory. There's no particular reason that men couldn't do this job. However, in farming communities, it would often be women that would sew clothing, so it seemed like a natural extension to have them doing this sort of job in a factory, despite the fact that now it was mechanized and anybody could have done these jobs. Overall, this leads to women's work being pretty devalued, both inside the home and out. So here you have some examples of this. You have a woman who's working as a secretary, and you have a mom of, I don't know, at least 3 kids that I can see that's doing work within the home. When you think of this stuff even still today, things like chores, work around the house, cleaning, cooking, all this sort of stuff, in American society is primarily seen as women's work, which is totally bizarre and weird. It's kind of a leftover, but the idea being, okay, men are going to be out in the factory all day, so women should take care of the household. However, when they take care of the household, they don't get paid any money, right, necessarily. So men are still the ones making money and then say, well, I should make decisions about how this money gets spent. I'm the one that's making it. But they're not necessarily paying attention to the fact that women are producing the environment in which that money can be made, or raising the children or stuff like this, and that's completely unpaid. Also, until pretty recently, most women working in Europe or the United States would have found themselves boxed out of certain jobs and more relegated to being like an assistant. So if a woman wanted to be a lawyer, that might be really difficult, but being a typist for a lawyer or an assistant for a lawyer would be pretty easy. So women's work is going to be sort of pushed to the side in the sort of industrial system or in the sort of capitalist system that emerges during this time. On the other hand, child labor is going to remain lucrative for a while. It's legal in the United States until the 1930s. So here you have a chimney sweep, right? A little boy who's a chimney cleaner. And then above me here, you have some coal miners. So the idea being, well, chimneys are pretty small. Even the big ones they're building in the factories, people have to be able to get up in the chimneys and go through them to be able to clean them out. So sending little boys up there works out great because they're pretty agile. You know, it doesn't take a lot of strength to clean a chimney. You can hang them through the chimney with some rope and just kind of slow pull them up as they clean. The same thing, these boys that are mining, you know, they can get back into like smaller areas. And this is pretty crazy, right? On the face of it, it sounds pretty intense, but remember, there's no such thing as a teenager yet. There's no like ideas like that. We'll get to that later. If you can lean, you can clean, right? If you've got a little extra time or mobility, you should be working. This leads to some pretty horrible results. There's lots and lots of accidents with these folks. Being a worker in industrial world as a child is pretty dangerous. Your brain's not fully formed, your dexterity is not fully developed, your strength obviously is lower. There's all kinds of situations for abuse. For example, if your chimney cleaners weren't cleaning fast enough, right, it talks about this in the book, factory workers might just turn the fires on and start running the machines. And yeah, it gets really hot and steamy in there. Well, that'll encourage the kids to move faster. Or, for example, a lot of kids that were chimney sweeps developed a particular type of testicular cancer from being exposed to all of the soot. So pretty nasty stuff, but you can sort of see where it comes from. If you grow up on a farm, everybody works on the farm. So by the time the kid is 4, you can teach them how to pet the chickens and take the little chicken eggs and bring them into the house. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if the family's working in a factory and you teach the 4-year-old how to work in the factory, it's just somehow it seems pretty different. And people hadn't really worked out how all of these systems were going to interact yet. Also, you can see there's a connection between health and environment during this time. Factory towns, and the factory is not a very clean working environment. There's a lot of byproducts from all of the burning. This is a painting of a steel mill in Pennsylvania, I'm pretty sure. And it just looks kind of crazy, right? It's like these massive fires and burning all through the night, working in a factory that might be really hot, really dirty. Is pretty bad for your health. Also, there's all kinds of exposure issues to new chemicals and new compounds that people weren't used to or didn't know the hazards of yet. This other depiction is of someone with cholera. Cholera was a disease that maybe originally came to Britain via India. It's kind of unclear, but it had to do with contaminated drinking water. Well, in a village where people have their own wells or have access to rivers, this is less of a problem. But if you're cramming a bunch of people into housing together and they're all sharing the same pipes and the same sewer systems, waterborne diseases become much more of a problem. There's outbreaks of cholera in the sort of industrial areas of Britain, particularly in areas where the water table is close to the surface or where the housing is kind of in depressions. So there's new sort of connections between industrialization and health and the sort of byproducts of industrialization and people's health. And this continues to be relevant today. People are constantly finding out new sort of aspects of this and how to work on it. So now that we have a sense of what industrial society looks like or some of the characteristics of it, we can start to think about the way people within these societies felt, how they began to see their labor, themselves, their communities within the new framework of industrial capitalism, within this new framework of urbanization. And we can talk about some of the sort of negatives that emerge out of it alongside of those benefits. So here I'll play a little video for you. This is actually made a little bit later, but it captures some of these feelings really well. So think about if you've ever had a job like this, or if you've ever seen some of these things, and then we'll kind of get to it. So check this out for a second.
Attention foreman. Trouble on bench 5. Check on the nut tightners. Nuts coming through loose on bench 5. Attention foreman. Back. Section 5, more speed, 4-7. Relief man passing. Relief man passing. Hey! Quit stalling. Get back to work. Go on. Section 5, give her the limit.
All right, so if you've never seen Modern Times. It's a great movie, Charlie Chaplin there. And he gets arrested, he gets thrown in jail, he does cocaine with his jailmate, they break out of jail and they go on a rampage around town. That's the rest of the movie. So in that factory scene, they're trying to sort of depict what it's like to work in a factory. There's all kinds of new problems. Most of you probably have worked, and you'll know some of these things that I'm about to go through really well. Sometimes work is not fun. In fact, a lot of work is not fun. And the idea that it should be is itself kind of strange, as maybe a way that's sold to you to continue to work. Anyway, let's take a look at some of these sorts of particulars that happen and what that does maybe to our psychology. So the first thing we might think about is industrial time and labor. So if you grow up on a farm and you work in the village, work starts when the sun comes up and it goes until sun goes down. Most farming activities, whether that be putting the cows out or fixing the fence or taking care of the chickens or watering the crops or whatever, you can really only do during the day. And then at night, you sort of retreat to your home and you take care of things inside of the house, you eat, you sleep, you kind of get ready for the next day. But industrial time is not like that. When do you work? Well, you have a shift. So you check in, you start working at 3 and you work till 11. And it doesn't particularly matter if it's light outside or dark outside or anything like that. There's a clock, there's a time, it's measurable. You're not paid by what you do. You're paid by how long you do it, how long you are at work. When you're a farmer, right, you raise your crop, you harvest it. However much you can harvest is how much you get paid, right? But that's completely untrue for industrial labor. Sometimes you're rewarded for making a lot of something or doing something particularly well, but most of you will have only worked in jobs where you get paid by the hour. So this all has to be very rationalized, right? Minutes, seconds, clocking in, clocking out, breaks, knowing exactly how long you worked, clocking out for lunch, all this sort of stuff. If you're a farmer, that's completely meaningless, right? You eat lunch when you're hungry and then get back to work. You have a certain amount of work you have to do during the day. But this leads to the sort of idea that if you're on the clock, you should be working. So if you've ever had a manager come near you and be like, hey, get back to work, or if you have time to lean, you have time to clean, or any of that sort of horrible crap, you'll know this sort of scenario, right? Once you clock in, you're supposed to be working nonstop the whole time as best you can because you're being paid for that time. So this is a new sort of idea about accountability and pace of work. You should be going kind of as fast as you can during that time when you're working because you're being paid for the time. Another sort of issue with this is your job is never really done. So for the farmer, there's a certain seasonality. You plant, right? You harvest. Then there's a sort of downtime in the winter. You can't go out and do that same job, right? Something else needs doing. Maybe you fix your roof, or maybe you work some other position in the village. But there's a certain sort of natural rhythm to your work. If you work at Waffle House, your job is never done. You have a shift, you come in, you do the same thing over and over, you go home. And then when it's your shift again, you come back. And there's no sort of stop to that. It's never like, I've made enough waffles, now I'm done making waffles, and I'm going to just do the milkshakes or something. It doesn't really work that way. So what is it like when you do a job that's never really done, and you're constantly sort of being told to do it better and faster because you're getting paid for the time? On top of that, in factory settings and in sort of modern work environments, you don't actually make a product or do a particular thing most of the time. So if you work in a factory today, if you work in like a Ford factory, you don't make a car, right, per se. It's more like that video we just watched. The car comes through, you put the windshield on. Another car comes through, you put a windshield on. Another car comes through, you put a windshield on. So your job is the windshield. You're not making a whole product. So for all of human history, that's not how stuff worked. You made a thing, or you did a thing. If you were a shoemaker, you made a shoe, start to finish. Then you sell it, or you sell it to someone who'll sell it. So you can have a sort of pride in that product, or you sort of see it through. You start on something, you finish something. But in a factory setting, that's not what happens. Remember that pin factory, right? If you're the person that sharpens the pin, all you do is sharpen the pin all day long. So you're not even really making pins, you're doing a task. But the problem is, people don't always like to do tasks, but we do sometimes take joy in making things. So a lot of people don't particularly love that system. It sort of separates you from the thing you're making. Another thing that you might critique or you might look at and say, ooh, this is looking kind of weird, is that people almost become sort of part of the machine. So remember we looked at the creation of interchangeable parts, and I tried to sort of draw the analogy to how workers themselves are kind of interchangeable parts. In a factory, people are sort of part of the overall mechanism. So this is sort of symbolizing that, I guess, in some ways, right? This guy working on a giant section maybe of a boiler, or these kids working, pulling thread, making sure the spools are working and stuff like that. Where do you stop between the machine and the person? And if the person is really just sort of running the machine, are they actually doing anything? What sort of fulfillment can they take with that? Is this the job you want? The modern equivalent, I guess, might be like if you're a computer designer and you sit with your computer just hunched over in there, typing code all day long. Where do you end? Where does the computer start? It can get kind of tricky, right? And you might feel a little bit like you're spending too much time doing it, you're too closely connected with it, and you're not sort of yourself in a certain way. Also, it can be really boring. It can cause anxiety, this sort of repetition, right? So we saw the guy, he's like wrenching that piece over and over and over again. He's bored. It's frustrating, the sort of repetition. Human beings might not be made to operate this way. And if you've ever had one of these jobs, most jobs are kind of like this, where every day is a little bit the same and repetitious, and you might start to feel just a little like, I gotta get out of here, man, or whatever, especially coupled with the clock, right? You can see how much time you have left. You're like, oh my God, do I really have to do this for 8 more hours, right? So these sorts of things, if you're a farmer, right, just because we kind of have to compare the two, or if you work in a village economy, things are different kind of every day. Stuff happens in a really more fluid way. There's different seasons, there's different days, there's different weather. None of that matters in industrial capitalism or in this sort of economy. You go, you do the same job, you do it over and over again until you die. I mean, you might get promoted, you might get a different job, but that's not the standard. That's not what you're necessarily supposed to do, right? You're supposed to get a job and have a job and do that job. And that causes people stress. That causes people anxiety. And we haven't really figured out what we're going to do about this yet as a society. And it's certainly getting worse, right? Just look at the amount of prescription drugs that are prescribed for anxiety or attention deficit disorder, or things like this. These things are on the increase, not the decrease. And part of it has to do with the way we relate to our jobs and what we make, right? Finally, this can be a really lonely and isolating vision of the world. If you see yourself as just sort of doing an activity, part of a job, part of a thing, you're not really making anything, you're not really doing anything, you're not necessarily contributing to society, you're sort of part of the mechanism, you might not necessarily be around others, You might be discouraged from talking or interacting with your coworkers, right? Because you're supposed to be focusing on work. The job is really repetitive. You might feel separate, not just from the other people you work with, but from nature, right? Everybody's working inside. You might feel separate from your family if other people in your household are working different sections of the factory or different factory jobs. It means less dinners together, right? It means less time together. You might feel separated from the things you make, right? If you're a shoemaker, but now you work in the shoe factory, you might just cut pieces of leather all day and never actually make a whole shoe. So the sort of modern working world that we find ourselves in is so different from the previous one that human beings found that there's a big sort of adjustment. And some of us have made it so deeply that we don't really recognize that it was a problem or that it's a problem for us. But many of us in our work are somewhat lonely and isolated. And obviously, given current conditions, that's not necessarily getting any better. What does this do to people long term? When you look at this picture of this girl, right? So this is kind of combining a lot of things, right? Child, labor, factory work, all these sorts of things. You can see in her expression something not great, right? I mean, it's sort of empathy practice here to try to figure out what's she feeling. And she's feeling sort of the collective weight, maybe, of all of these things around her and her sort of separation from a more natural world and from a sort of previous work environment. And it's something that human beings have struggled with since industrialization and haven't quite perfected our response to yet. But that doesn't mean people weren't trying. As soon as industrial capitalism becomes sort of the norm, as soon as factories start to grow, as soon as these sort of class divisions start, people are critical of them. People notice that they're not always healthy. They don't make happy people. It doesn't necessarily serve everyone equally. So people write and discuss the sort of negative physical or psychological or spiritual effects this process is having on individuals and on society at large. Some of the earliest groups to do this are called Luddites. This was a movement in Britain that rejected mechanization, rejected the sort of early industrialization as taking away the skills and power and knowledge that had traditionally been the craftsman's prerogative. So people had particular trades. They had spent their whole life mastering furniture making. And that was a sort of important role for them. It provided an identity. But now there's a factory that spits out furniture much more quickly. Maybe it's better quality, maybe not, but it's certainly less artistic. It's not handmade, it's mass-produced. And so Luddites argued that this application of technology was sort of making an imperfect future. It was stripping the best parts of work away from people and mass-producing things that were not as great and just sort of changing the world around them. So in protest, they begin to actively work against this process. Sometimes that involves destroying machines, burning factories, even killing some factory owners in the sort of general rebellion against this switch to industrialization. The British government is going to very harshly repress these groups. They send soldiers to go attack and detain Luddites to prevent them from destroying property, to prevent them from sort of stopping the industrial process or the growth of factories. And in 1813, there's a huge show trial in the town of York, or the city of York, where Luddites are prosecuted for their crimes, and 14 are executed. It largely ended the movement. But this was just one early example of groups of craft people or people with specialized skills rebelling against industrialization that sort of stripped them of their role in society based on that. The movement pretty much ended, but sometimes you still hear the word. A Luddite is like a person who is opposed to technology or fears technology. It gets used that way, even though it's not necessarily what they were about. But the Luddites weren't the only group of people that were working on these things. Another really broad term for philosophers or writers or thinkers or activists that were concerned with industrialization was socialists. Socialists were concerned about social problems caused by industrialization and capitalism. The word social, socialism, socialist, society, right? They're all the same root word. So you had a bunch of people that began to look at factories, look at industrialization and say, yeah, this stuff's really cool. We can make all kinds of mass-produced products. Every home can have a new stove. Every house could have running water, right? All these sorts of benefits. But we have to figure out how to apply this stuff. We have to figure out how to keep the human element. We have to figure out how to make industrialization work for human beings instead of human beings just working for industrialization. And sometimes these people are referred to as utopian. They're envisioning a better society, a sort of best case scenario. And how do they get to that? So there's lots of them, some specifically the sort of early movements like Charles Fourier, who works on this idea of an intentional community. So you have a factory and a factory town. What if everybody benefited from the factory? Rather than the factory making the factory owner rich, what if everybody in the factory was sort of equally invested? So when the factory did well, the whole community did well. Instead of slums and poverty and being paid by the wage, people could be paid based on how much the factory kind of produced, and that could be distributed throughout the community. He had this idea of love and education. So within the community, everybody could learn, they could develop, and the sort of fruits of industrial labor would be spread amongst the people in the particular community. A sort of early utopian thinker. You have other people that are making things like trade unions, right? These were often run by socialists. These were people who said, look, okay, yeah, factories are great. They're providing all this new material benefit and wealth for society, but we should do it in a way that's fair to everybody. The rich shouldn't be the only people that are benefiting. And the way we might do this is we might provide rights for workers, things like shorter work days or reasonable pay or safety regulations. All of these things were fought for by trade unions. And they give you things like the 8-hour workday, right? This was a socialist idea. The idea was you have 8 hours where you work, 8 hours where you rest, and then 8 hours where you do whatever you want during the day, kind of dividing the day into 3 parts. So, or things like the weekend, right, come from these trade unions and socialist programs. Any kind of right you can think of, women's rights, children's rights, all the sort of labor laws and protections, those are all coming from these groups. None of this stuff was given to workers. People had to fight for all of these things. And so you might think, well, safety laws, I'd rather not wear a hard hat at work. Well, it's not necessarily about that. It's about them being provided. And so originally factories were incredibly dangerous places. People died at huge rates in these places because they didn't have things like safety rails. So people might fall right over the sides into the gears of the machine and just get ripped apart. And the factory owners didn't build safety rails in there because they weren't going to work down there. They didn't really care. Workers were somewhat interchangeable, right, and disposable. So all of these laws had to be sort of fought for by people to get these protections in the first place. Yeah, here's that intentional community, one of the early ones that people did actually try to build these. These weren't like just totally abstract ideas. People did try to implement these policies on the ground. Another more extreme version of socialism is communism. This arises in the sort of mid-1800s. And basically communism argues that industrial capitalism, sort of industrialized society, is fundamentally exploitative and unfair, and that the whole system runs on people, the vast majority of them, being exploited by the wealthy and those who have power. So the people who are wage laborers are treated unfairly, they're paid poorly, they're kept in poverty, in essence, to produce more and more wealth for the people at the top, thus creating these big divisions between social classes. So the goal of communism was to erase that system, was to make it so that the working class folks had a say within their communities, had a say within their work, didn't get alienated from their labor, and actually saw the rewards of the working. They say, look, it's sort of unfair. You have these people that have vast amounts of money, primarily from ancient hereditary titles, or because they were seen as nobles, or because they were religious authorities. And when industrialization starts, they're the ones that buy factories. They're the ones that produce the machines. And they invest their money in it. After that, they make money for nothing. They don't do anything. They make money because they have money. If you have $100 million today, you never need to get a job. You invest that money and you'll make money for doing nothing. This is vastly different than if you have to work for money. Communism seeks to sort of flip this upside down and say that, yeah, okay, investment's good, capital is required, but the people who are actually doing the work should be the ones who are actually making the profits. Why should one small group of people get tremendously rich because they already had a bunch of money when they're not the ones actually building the things? The people who actually build the things should make the money. And so you could hold the factory in common, right? You could have a sort of shared means of production, and then people would all benefit much more. The sort of big name associated with this, although there were lots of other thinkers, is Karl Marx. And if you know about Marx, or if you've seen him, you probably imagine him like this, like old Papa Marx, or like Santa Clausy Marx, or whatever. But actually, when he was a young man is when he was doing a lot of this work. He's a historian, he's a philosopher. The field of sociology essentially starts with Marx. And his main sort of thesis, his main idea, was that all of history was driven by class struggle. And so there's always a sort of elite, wealthy, powerful, or authoritarian class that takes advantage of the poor or takes advantage of the lower classes or those without power to enrich themselves. But this always causes a problem, and eventually the people on the bottom rebel and overturn those systems of power and create a new system. But what he imagined communism doing was sort of ending that process. He encouraged a working class revolution that people, factory laborers, wage laborers, should get together and fight for what they wanted. There would be tremendously more of them, the power is sort of in the numbers. And he was a major influence on economic and social thought, and continues to be so. His ideas haven't really been solved. It's easy to take some of his arguments and poke holes in them, or say you disagree with them, but his observations about how capitalism works and how it exploits people are pretty rock solid. It doesn't mean you have to think, well, you know, his ideas are great. They might not be. But his observations about how the system worked are pretty clear, and that's one of the reasons that he hasn't really gone away, or his work hasn't really gone away, because people can always relate to this, because industrial society does do these sorts of things. So here I'll show you a little video that breaks this down using computer stuff for you that might help out, and then I'll talk to you about it in a second.
Consider, my dear viewers, a world without money, without class divisions, where everyone gives according to their abilities and takes according to their needs. Sounds pretty sweet, no? To German poet and philosopher Karl Marx, such a communist utopia was not only possible, it was inevitable, or what he called the march of history. Though deeply influenced by Hegel, who proposed that history develops through the abstract concept of world spirit, Marx believed that it is not conflict of ideas that propels history, but rather conflict arising out of our relation to material goods that will bring history to its end. specifically our working conditions. Marx calls this historical process dialectical materialism. Initially, humanity was concerned only with the most basic acts of our species, producing for personal survival. But as the population multiplied, economic systems were established to address the needs of all. And with economics, an individual's relationship to the products they create changes, for one is no longer producing for their own immediate needs. They are producing for others. Fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, where mankind created mechanisms to fulfill the needs of many with unprecedented efficiency. These mechanisms, or capital, are owned by individuals, leading to enormous concentrations of wealth. And for the tired worker who must operate these machines, there is no getting ahead. For in order for the capitalist to maximize profit, he must pay the workers little more than is necessary to survive. To Marx, this economic system of capitalism thrives on exploitation and creates widespread unhappiness through what he calls alienation. For starters, I am alienated from the fruits of my labor. If I create a turnip, it'll be sold to another. And in exchange, I'll be paid a wage and become as much of a commodity as the thing I produce. Thus, I am removed from my work. I do not see myself in my labor. Capitalism also alienates us from each other. For the worker to produce efficiently, the capitalist tells them they are in constant competition for their job, thereby turning our fellow man into an adversary rather than an ally. Furthermore, capitalism alienates us from our very nature. Creating is a great source of satisfaction for our species. But because we are forced to make things that we have no personal investment in, our lives become a burden. As time goes on, and industrial powers become increasingly concentrated among a select elite, the gap between the working class and the capitalist will only become wider. To Marx, this gap will eventually become so pronounced that the workers, in their profound frustration, will rise up and overthrow the oppression of the few and usher in a new society. A society in which there is no private property, there are no class divisions, where people's labor is held for the common good, and where all work according to their ability. And that, my friends, is communism. Even today, Marxism is one of the most powerful ideologies in the world. And to some, the ushering in of the Marxist utopia still lies in the not-too-distant future.
Okay, so that's pretty good. Little 8-bit cinema there for you if you were wondering how Marx and Mario are related or whatever. Anyway, yeah, that does a really good job sort of breaking down that concept of alienation and how workers are sort of pitted against each other or pitted against the system in order to keep them exploited. And again, whether or not you agree with those ideas, it's more important to think about the arguments Marx is making against industrial capitalism and think about if those are valid, rather than necessarily his solution. And the arguments he makes, yeah, are pretty hard to get around. We'll talk about this sort of stuff more as it kind of comes up later. These problems don't get solved. At least they haven't necessarily yet. Next time we'll be kind of switching gears a little bit. We'll see how some of this stuff, some of these world history ideas are playing out within the particular context of the United States and Latin America, just because there's sort of a division in the New World and all these sort of colonies that form new nations versus what happens in Europe and Africa and East Asia during the 19th century. So next time we'll sort of focus on the Americas just a little bit, to get us ready for sort of thinking about the 20th century and some of these differences that are going to spin out that are kind of more hemisphere-wide. So read that Traditions and Encounters, get thinking about that. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, see you next time.